there's a striking fact that challenges our conventional understanding of the 19th century. Karl Marx, one of the most influential thinkers of that era, a man whose work was dedicated to analyzing the capitalist system born in England, could not speak a word of English until he was 30 years old. This isn't some obscure detail. It's mentioned by his closest friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels, in the preface to Marx's magnum opus, Das Kapital. Engels notes that between 1843 and 1845, when Marx was studying the works of English economists, he had to read them in French translation. At the time, the future great philosopher and economist was nearly 30, and his lack of English skills apparently didn't pose any serious problems for him. You might think this is just a biographical quirk, a minor detail. But the thing is, Marx was not an exception. The high school he attended until he was 17 had an intensive curriculum. He studied Latin, ancient Greek, and French. But English simply wasn't on the syllabus. Marx likely mastered the language only after 1849, when he was exiled first to Paris and then to London, where he would live for many years. But the fact itself is astounding. A man whose intellectual work was so deeply connected to England didn't consider it necessary to learn its language. And he wasn't alone. Similarly, future Russian writers and intellectuals didn't study English in their schools. It wasn't even part of the curriculum for the young Vladimir Lenin. And this brings us to a major, almost absurd question. How is it possible that in the mid-19th century, the language of the world's leading power, the language of the Industrial Revolution, was a language nobody seemed to need? After all, the England of that era, as we are told, already ruled the seas, having defeated every imaginable rival. Its navy was the foundation of its power. In international trade, according to Engels himself, English units of weight and volume were already widely used. And yet, no one in continental Europe fought to include English in the mandatory school curriculum for educated people. One could argue that people of the past were simply not very forward-thinking, but that explanation seems too simple and unconvincing. This strange linguistic vacuum is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a clue, suggesting that the picture of the world we've come to accept might be wrong. We're used to thinking of England at that time as the undisputed leader, whose influence was total. But if even the intellectuals studying its economy could easily get by without its language, perhaps its real position was entirely different. This paradox is not an accident. It forces us to reconsider everything we know about that era. It suggests that in the middle of the 19th century, the world was structured very differently from how we've been told. And to understand how it was truly structured, we need to take a closer look at that very same England, whose language was somehow left on the sidelines of Europe's intellectual life. So we're left with a startling inconsistency. England was supposedly the ruler of the seas, the center of the industrial world, yet its language remains something of an exotic dialect, one that the best educational institutions in Europe feel no need to teach. It's like an absurd scenario where the whole world uses American technology, but no one knows a single word of English. The simplest explanation that comes to mind is to blame the short-sightedness of people in the past, to assume they were simply foolish, unable to recognize the obvious trends. But that approach doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It's not only arrogant, but also nonsensical. We're talking about the intellectual elite of Europe, the people who were advancing science, philosophy, and literature. They couldn't have been blind. Therefore, if they weren't studying English, there must have been a compelling reason. And that reason, most likely, is that our picture of England's power in the first half of the 19th century is greatly exaggerated, if not distorted. Perhaps its influence was not so all-encompassing, and its status not so undisputed.
Let's look at Germany during the same period, where Marx and Engels came from. In that same preface to Das Kapital, Engels ironically remarks that in Germany at the time, there were as many systems of weights and measures as there are days in the year. In his economic work, Marx had to use English units because making sense of the German chaos was impossible. A unified state called Germany did not yet exist. It would only appear in 1871. It would seem that against this backdrop of fragmentation and disorder, the orderly and powerful England should have looked like an unattainable ideal. But for some reason, people chose to study French, Latin, and Greek, not the language of this ideal. This suggests that the real weight of England in the eyes of Europeans was quite different. So what happened? If England was not the global hegemon in the middle of the century, how did it become one in just a few decades? Its rise to a leading position in the world happened precisely in the second half of the 19th century. Such a rapid, explosive growth doesn't look like gradual evolution. It's more like a situation where one of the contestants in a race suddenly gains a massive, unforeseen advantage. And here we arrive at a bold but logical hypothesis. What if the cause of this surge was not the nation's own genius, but an external event? Some global upheaval, a catastrophe that fundamentally changed the rules of the game for the entire planet. As a result of this event, former leaders could have lost their positions, while territories that suffered less were given a unique opportunity. The post-catastrophic world took shape in such a way that the British Isles found themselves in the most advantageous position. Perhaps livable conditions were restored there more quickly, which allowed them to become the assembly point of a new world, a center of attraction for intellectual and material resources from all over the planet. Let's imagine that this new world, born from the ruins of the old one, truly gave the British Isles a colossal head start. While other territories were recovering from a global shock, England became an island of relative stability and order. And as always happens, resources immediately began to flow to such a place. Not just material resources, gold, goods, technology, but more importantly, intellectual ones. Scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs from all over Europe and the world were drawn to a place where they could continue to work and build the future. This is how the famous London melting pot began to form, which would soon become the financial and industrial center of the planet.
But a mere fortunate turn of events is not enough to build a lasting empire. Leadership won by chance is a fragile thing. It must be proven daily, strengthened, and most importantly, legitimized. You can't just tell the world, we got lucky, so now we're in charge. For your right to rule to be unquestioned, you need a foundation. And that foundation is always history. A great, continuous, and glorious history proving that your current position is not an accident, but the logical outcome of a centuries-long journey to the top. What was needed was a history of great navigators, brave explorers, wise rulers, and an invincible navy that had always been the nation's backbone. And here lies the key problem. What if such a flawless and inspiring history simply wasn't available at the right moment? What if the real past was far more modest and unsuited for grand imperial ambitions? The answer is obvious. If the history you need doesn't exist, you must create it. You must write it, adjust it, supplement it, and, most importantly, instill it in the public consciousness. A tremendous, meticulous effort was needed to ensure that no one around the world would ever doubt England's right to dictate its will to territories near and far. This process of preparing for leadership took decades. But how do you do it? In the mid-19th century, the main tool for spreading information, the internet and television of its time, was literature. It was into this sphere that unimaginably vast resources were thrown. A work of fiction is, in this sense, far more effective than a dry historical chronicle. An exciting adventure story will be read by millions, while a boring list of dates and events will only interest a handful of scholars. And the technique for legalizing fictional events was simple and brilliant. All you had to do was announce that an ancient manuscript had been accidentally discovered somewhere in the attic of an old castle or in a dusty library archive and was now being published. This happened, for instance, with the music of Bach. The composer, who lived in the 18th century, was long forgotten. It was only in the mid-19th century that his scores were found, after which he was instantly transformed into the greatest genius of all time. And it seems that events unfolded according to this very scenario, bringing to the forefront of world literature a mysterious and incredibly important figure for our story, a man named Daniel Defoe.
Let's take a look at the man credited with authoring this cornerstone of British mythology. The official biography of Daniel Defoe, born in London in 1660, paints a picture of anyone but a reclusive writer. He received a religious education but gave up a career in the church for more worldly pursuits. His entire life he was a merchant and a political operator. He owned a hosiery factory, a brick and tile factory, and traded wine. Defoe was a man of action, not words. His biography is filled with political intrigue. He was a secret agent, working for one party and then another. He experienced highs and lows and even spent time in debtor's prison. His life ended in 1731 in a rented apartment, far from his family and friends. It is said he was buried by casual acquaintances, and his landlady sold his personal belongings to cover the expenses. And this is where it gets really interesting. More than 100 years pass. The mid-19th century arrives, the very time when the emerging British Empire urgently needs a great maritime history. And it is precisely at this moment that the grave of the long-forgotten merchant Defoe is found. A coincidence? Perhaps. But let's look further. This man, whose life was filled with business worries and political adventures, is suddenly credited with authoring nearly 500 works. 500! This number includes not only 8 novels, the most famous of which is Robinson Crusoe, but also a foundational work that could be called a general history of the pirates. This book contains the biographies of 17 of the most significant pirates. Note, significant, not well known, because there is every reason to believe that before this book was published, many of them had never been heard of, and they became famous precisely because of it. A very clear picture emerges, one that looks like a well-planned operation. In the mid-19th century, England's leaders needed a history of their navy, a history of maritime dominance. A group of anonymous but talented writers is tasked with creating this history. They can't write under their own names. They need historical depth. It's desirable for the books to be dated to an earlier time, say the early 18th century. But every book needs an author. After digging through surviving archives, the organizers of this project seem to have found the perfect candidate, a certain merchant named Defoe. His biography is full of blank spots. He died in obscurity, and he has no influential descendants who might object. He is the perfect ghost to whom anything can be attributed.
Of course, this may all seem like a bold conjecture, a conspiracy theory. A biography, no matter how suspicious, is circumstantial evidence. But the most convincing, almost irrefutable evidence that Robinson Crusoe was written much later than its claimed date is hidden not in the murky life of its supposed author. It is printed right on the pages of the novel itself. The text contains facts, details, and knowledge that no one in the era it describes could possibly have known. These are technical and scientific anachronisms that completely give away the true time of the book's creation. Let's open the book and immerse ourselves in Robinson's world, but this time, let's look at it not as a reader, but as a forensic investigator, searching for clues. The most obvious and irrefutable fact that screams of forgery is how easily and casually the characters determine their geographical coordinates. Remember, Robinson ends up on the island after a violent storm that battered his ship for many days. But this doesn't stop him from declaring with astonishing precision that on September 30th, 1659, he set foot on an island located at a latitude of 9 degrees and 22 minutes north of the equator. 9 degrees, 22 minutes. For a person in the 17th or even 18th century, such accuracy was pure fantasy. Determining latitude in equatorial regions is an extremely difficult task in itself. You need to measure the angle between the North Star and the horizon.
But near the equator, the star is barely visible. Moreover, in those days, the North Star was still quite far from the celestial pole, which introduced further errors. Now, imagine trying to take these measurements on the deck of a ship being tossed about during a storm. It's simply impossible. But the author goes even further. The text also mentions longitude coordinates. While they are given with an accuracy of a degree, this too is absolute nonsense for the era described. The problem of determining longitude at sea was the greatest navigational challenge for centuries. To solve it, an instrument was needed that could keep accurate time on the open sea, regardless of the ship's motion, humidity, and temperature changes. This device, the marine chronometer, was invented by John Harrison only in the mid-18th century, long after Daniel Defoe had passed away. And without a chronometer, any talk of determining longitude is like discussing the flow capacity of a plumbing system before the discovery of the principle of communicating vessels. It is knowledge that the era simply did not possess.
And the author of the novel doesn't just mention coordinates in passing, he emphasizes them. Why? Would the story have been any less interesting if the writer hadn't included degrees and minutes? Obviously not. These details have no impact on the plot, but they serve another, far more important ideological function. They create a lasting impression in the reader's mind that English sailors, as early as the 17th century, possessed advanced navigational technologies, and that their navy was the most advanced and science-driven in the world. This is not an author's mistake. It is a deliberate, carefully planned move designed to retroactively reinforce the myth of England's centuries-old maritime supremacy. And this method of historical implantation, where facts from the future are embedded into the past, was not limited to literature. Remarkably, we can find traces of this very same technique in a completely unrelated story, the history of railway construction in the Russian Empire. There is a well-known and undisputed fact. The railway arrived in the city of Saratov in 1871. This is a precise date recorded in all sources. Now, pay close attention. In 1862, 9 years before this event, an official brochure was printed in a Moscow printing house under the title Regulations on Free Tickets for the Saratov Railway. This is not a typo on the title page. The text of the brochure itself makes it clear that it refers to the year 1862. It details exactly which officials and employees are entitled to free travel and how much luggage they can carry. The absurdity of the situation is that at this time, not only was there no railway, but there wasn't even a final decision on where it would run. There were different proposals: to route it south towards Commission or towards Kiritzin. How could there be any talk of free tickets and luggage allowances when engineers hadn't even finalized the route? Nevertheless, we are looking at an official document. The brochure was reviewed and approved by the censor on August 20th, 1862. To put it bluntly, what we are seeing is a forgery.
This small, seemingly trivial incident with the Saratov brochure actually reveals the entire mechanics of this giant history factory. It becomes clear how meticulously every little detail related to the past was crafted. The creator's logic was simple and effective. The more minute, specific, and seemingly insignificant facts appear in historical literature and archives, the more quickly people will believe that the constructed past was real. After all, who would doubt the existence of a railway if you can hold in your hands a detailed, censor-approved regulation about its tickets? These minor details act like anchors, securing the big lie in the public consciousness. Robinson Crusoe, with its fictional degrees and minutes, is the exact same kind of brochure about a non-existent railway, just in a literary cover. Its purpose is not to entertain, but to create the illusion of a historical fact, the illusion of England's great maritime past. We don't know the specific goal of those who published the regulations for free tickets, but we can confirm the forgery itself and conclude that this was likely far from an isolated case. This was systematic work. And now that we understand the mechanism and see evidence of its application in different fields, from literature to transportation documents, the final, crucial question arises. Why was all this necessary? What was the ultimate goal of this grandiose, multi-year, and obviously very expensive operation to rewrite history? The answer to this question leads us to the event that officially cemented Britain's dominance over the entire planet. So why was this colossal, multi-year effort to create a fictional past necessary? What was the ultimate goal of this gigantic project, traces of which we find in literature and official documents alike? All these seemingly separate threads, Marx's surprising lack of English, the mysterious anachronisms in Robinson Crusoe, the fake brochure about the Saratov Railway, converge on a single point in time. That point is the year 1884, and the event is the International Meridian Conference in Washington. At this conference, more than just a technical issue was being decided. The stakes were immeasurably higher. The question being decided was where the symbolic center of the world would be located, the point on the map from which the entire planet, all nations and all ships at sea would measure space and time. To adopt a particular meridian as the prime meridian meant recognizing the country it passed through as the world leader, not just in politics or economics, but in the very coordinate system of humanity. And it was precisely to ensure that at this decisive moment, none of the participants would have a shadow of a doubt that the long, glorious, albeit fictional history of the British Navy was needed.
Conferences like this are not held spontaneously. They are prepared for decades in advance. Even if the decision is known beforehand, it is necessary to create the appearance of a discussion, to prepare an irrefutable argument. And the best argument was the very history that had been so diligently written all that time. Books like Robinson Crusoe were not just entertainment. They were cultural artillery that fired on minds in advance, crushing the will to resist. How could anyone propose a meridian in Paris or Pulkovo when the myth that English sailors had been masters of the oceans for centuries, that they had known how to determine coordinates with incredible accuracy since time immemorial, was already firmly rooted in the global consciousness? Any objections would shatter against this invisible but solid fortress built by literature. Of course, neither Daniel Defoe nor his hero, Robinson Crusoe, was mentioned in the conference protocol. But they had done their work long before it began, eliminating from potential opponents even the thought that any other decision could be made. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. The Greenwich Meridian was adopted as the prime meridian. From that year to this day, the entire world has measured longitude from London, the center of the newly established empire. Mission accomplished. But, as often happens, in uncovering one deception, we inadvertently stumble upon another, one that is deeper and stranger. While exposing the forgery, we ourselves failed to notice that we were facing a mystery of a different scale. It is hidden in those very coordinates of Robinson Crusoe. We understood why he couldn't have known them, but we haven't yet asked the question, what if the geography described in the book points to something incredible? What if, in exposing the lie about technology, we have stumbled upon the truth of a catastrophe that changed the very face of the earth? So, London became the official center of the world. The grand operation to construct history had succeeded. It would seem we could leave it at that. The plan has been uncovered, the motives are clear, the result is recorded in protocols and on every map on the planet. But it is precisely at the moment when a mystery seems solved that the most insignificant details, discarded during the investigation, begin to glow with an unsettling light. Let's return to that very island, to the same coordinates that served as the main evidence against the official story. We proved that Robinson couldn't have known his longitude and latitude with such precision. But we made one mistake. We believed that the geography described in the book corresponded to reality, and we were only looking for technological inconsistencies. What if we look at it more closely?
The author gives us very precise reference points. He writes that from Robinson's Island, one could see the island of Trinidad, located several dozen miles away. In the vicinity of the real Trinidad, there are two islands that could theoretically be the prototype. One is Grenada, but it's nearly 150 kilometers away and impossible to see. The other is the island of Tobago. It's a perfect match in terms of size and distance, less than 40 kilometers. Many researchers believe it is the very island of Robinson Crusoe. But here we face a real puzzle that turns everything upside down. The author states explicitly that Trinidad was to the northwest of Robinson's Island. But the real island of Tobago is to the northeast of Trinidad. The directions don't match. One could attribute this to a writer's error, to carelessness. But let's conduct a thought experiment. Let's trust the author and place a hypothetical Robinson's Island just as he described it, that is, southeast of Trinidad, at a distance of about 40 kilometers, so that Trinidad is visible to the northwest. If we do this on a modern map, then from this point, inevitably, directly ahead, the enormous continent of South America would be visible. But Robinson never once mentions that he lived for 28 years in direct sight of the mainland. The geography of the book does not match the geography of the real world. And here, stumbling upon this unsolvable contradiction, a wild, impossible, yet singularly logical thought creeps in. What if the author wasn't mistaken? What if he described with documentary accuracy what he saw? But in his time, the coordinate system itself was different. What if the compass didn't point where it points today? This question takes us beyond human conspiracies and falsifications and brings us face to face with something immeasurably larger. Has north always been north? Could there have been a shift in the Earth's geographic poles in the recent, by historical standards, past? This question remains unanswered, but it forces us to look at the entire history we have just unraveled in a completely new light. What if that global catastrophe that gave Britain its advantage was not just an economic or social event, but a geological event of planetary scale? What if the true history of our world is hidden not so much in forged documents, but in the orientation of ancient temples and fortresses that suddenly face the wrong way? An investigation that began with one strange fact from the biography of Karl Marx has led us to the threshold of a mystery capable of changing our understanding not only of the past, but of the very world we live in. And it seems this is only the beginning.